Now, we're delighted to welcome our guest speaker for this evening's talk, Fernanda Paiva, who I first had the pleasure of meeting at an Aquarius Severn talk in 2019. Fernanda is a teacher and practicing astrologer who has a BA in history, and she acquired her astrology certificate with distinction at the London School of Astrology. And she has articles published by Flare UK, I Am Infinity magazine, the AA Journal, and at the Astrodienst website. And Fernanda is currently working on her thesis for the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology at the University of Wales. And Fernanda is originally from Brazil, but was living in the UK for the past 14 years. But she's just let me know that she's at the moment in Greece. So welcome, Fernanda, and over to you.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's really nice to see so many faces. So let me start by sharing my screen. Great. So welcome everyone to an astrological look at the Ukrainian situation. So tonight, what I'm proposing with this talk is what I would call a holistic view. So it has a lot to do with a little bit of my style of working, which is sort of like, I see astrology as a kind of a detective work. So rather than impose, or at least I'd like to see as like, rather than imposing my opinion onto the charts and trying to, create talk based on what I believe, I'm trying to see what emerges from the charts. So what we're going to be doing today is to have a look at a myriad of charts. So it's sort of a perspective. So I don't really hold the truth. I love to do this little disclaimer before my talks. It's more like an invitation. It's more like an invitation for a perspective that's very much based on a kind of a detective work, sort of seeing charts, and then one chart kind of led to another and another. And so don't worry if it's too many charts. Just try to come with me in this journey. Like, try to see tonight as a kind of a journey. And don't worry about trying to keep details of, everything. Just sort of come with me through this little window and let's, see what emerges from these different charts that I kind of looked into for this talk, for the Ukrainian situation. So let's have a look at Russia. So with that also, before moving into the charts, I am not really going to base this talk on predictions. So this talk about the Ukrainian situation won't be focused very much on what are the transits, what is the ingresses charts, and what's going to be happening with the war, but more of a kind of trying to understand what the background is, and try to see what emerges from the symbolism. And then later on we can discuss a little bit about the transits and what we think this could be reflecting. So let's have a look at Russia first. And also, because of the MA, I have access to a lot of academic material, and every time I put a talk together, I really like to see through an academic perspective as well. So a lot of the material that we have here is what academia is talking about, the Ukrainian war. And I thought that would be interesting. I don't particularly follow the news very much. So I'm more, looking into these other articles to see what they're talking about the situation. And these papers that I'm using for this talk tonight were all written between February and April. So the most recent one was written in 22nd of April. So it's not too long ago. So the first quote that we have right there in front of us, which I thought was interesting in terms of understanding what this, situation is about. So the author says it's already clear that Russia's action upsets the world order that has existed since the end of World War II. So it's kind of like, it gave me this idea and this clue that it takes us way back further than, what's happening since February. So the first Russian chart that we have in front of us, and this is like a little bit of the journey. Again, remember, I'm sharing you the journey that I went through when I was trying to put this talk together. So I found this article by Lynn Hayes that was talking about Russian charts. And according to her, so she considers this one the Russian chart. Now, I know there's a lot of debates of which chart, etc. But according to her, she uses this one. That is the date that the First Congress of People's Deputies of the Russian Federation adopted the Declaration of Russia's national sovereignty. Now, this chart doesn't particularly speak to me, so I'm not really going to go too much into this chart. There's also that, because I'm going to be showing quite a few charts. Some of them I will go a little bit more, some of them I won't go with too much depth. And this one doesn't speak to me as much because it's too much mutability. So we have a sun in Gemini, a chart ruler in Gemini, the angles in mutable signs as well. And for some reason, that doesn't really represent Russia to me particularly. Brazil has a lot of mutability, and I can see a lot of mutability in Brazil, this sort of capacity to sort of adapt and, you know, but I don't have this feeling when I think about Russia. In the same article, Hayes is saying that Nicholas Kempin considers this chart as well one of the official Russian charts, which is when the agreement was ratified by the Russian parliament. So here we have a Taurus rising. And that somehow would resonate a little bit more for me, with a Taurus rising, with a Pluto on the descendant as well, and this sort of, you know, the relationships, you know, kind of connected with the Scorpio Taurus, the midheaven in Capricorn, that also kind of resonates a little bit more to me as well. But it doesn't stop there, because yet there's another accepted version there, and that's when Belarus, the Russian Federation, and the Ukraine announced the Minsk Declaration, which dissolved the Soviet Union. So this is another chart that's in Nicholas Kempin's book, representing Russia, which is from the 8th of December, 91. And this chart I chose to use throughout the talk because Rod Cheng told me he uses this chart, if I'm not wrong. And because he does a lot of mundane, I was having a conversation with him before I put the presentation together. And I decided to follow his perspective a little bit there. And we do have a Cancer rising, so a Capricorn descendant at 23. And we know that Pluto was hovering about there the last couple of years. We have also Moon in Capricorn, so the chart ruler in Capricorn, and that somehow does resonate a little bit with Russia for me. You know, Capricorn for me gives me a feeling that makes a little bit more sense. I know there is a lot of Sagittarius there, but it does kind of represent the sort of territory and expansion, or the need for expanding the territory somehow. So that chart kind of speaks to me a little bit. But then it doesn't stop there, because apparently Adrian Ross Duncan uses the chart from the 25th of December 91, which is when the Russian flag was flying in at the Kremlin, which is like, I don't know what time that flag was flying, and you know, seems, you know, I don't even know what time I would cast that, but apparently there's another chart. And then when I went to the astrodienst, which is where I get most of my charts, you know, I went after the Russian chart. There wasn't a Russian chart, that was the Soviet Union's chart. And I was a bit puzzled, because I mainly use, you know, the astro.com to get my charts. And I was like, oh, they're still considering the Soviet chart for some reason. But throughout the research that I was doing with the academic papers and the academic material to understand the war, the more I felt that the Soviet Union as a chart is still relevant to the situation. So this quote there from one of the papers is saying that the tension between Russia's self-perception as a great power and the perception of others defines Russian foreign policy. Now, this for me was, again, like, was giving a big clue about the situation. So there's something about the Russian need to be perceived as a potency that's not being respected. That's kind of being infringed somehow in the situation. And the Soviet Union was a kind of a project, was a type of a project there somehow, political or geopolitical project there that had behind also this idea of being a great potency, and, you know, the whole like Cold War. And so it gave me this idea as well of like, it's not really a third world war like some people were mentioning, but maybe a second Cold War. And so I felt that the Soviet Union's chart was still relevant. And so I kept, we're going to see the Soviet Union's chart throughout the talk as well as that previous chart that I showed, I said I chose as well. Now, in this chart, we have a T square I find very relevant, and I'm just going to point out so you keep that loosely in mind as we go through the charts. So there is a T square of Sun in Capricorn opposite Pluto at 10 Cancer, is square that Chiron in Aries. So that's a very important T cross there, and it does give me this sense of like the need for power, the need for respect. Pluto being in the 11th house as well, which is, is for me, again, like I don't really do traditional or mundane astrology. That's not really my specialty in any way. But Pluto in the 11th does give me a sense of the collective and needing to come across as powerful amongst, the group. And that Sun Pluto there, and also the Sun square Chiron there as well. So that for me gave me a little bit of that feeling like, it does resonate somehow for me. And Mars Uranus in Pisces as well in the 7th, and the lack of boundaries, annexing places and territories. The Moon, Venus, and MCIC in Taurus and Scorpio as well. That also kind of, I always felt that Russia was very mysterious, very secret somehow, always have that kind of feeling about it as well. So this chart somehow really called my attention for a few different reasons, and we're going to go back to it. But according to Jessica Adams, Russia has 19 astrology charts. So if we're really going to go through all of the charts, it would be loads of charts, and we'll be here the whole night trying to decide which one will be the correct Russian chart. So Jessica Adams calls them rebirth charts. So they're charts of rebirth because Russia kept reinventing itself, that they are all like rebirth charts. So that's something that was interesting. And obviously we've got Putin's chart, which is dirty data. So we can't really trust this chart or this time because it's not really necessarily accurate. It would be very fitting to have a Pluto on the midheaven in Leo, to how we kind of generally perceive him to be as a leader. But we don't really know his data, so we can't really trust this time. And on the side here, we have a couple of quotes as well, again, from my research about Putin. So on top of saying that Putin has often repeated his statement that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. So again, this is kind of pointing out, he's been in power for like over 30 years. And it somehow feels like there is an agenda there, that there is a kind of a hidden agenda there on the movements and the moves that he does and what's going on there. At least again, this is like through my, little window of perspective. So the second quote there that seems a bit big and stuff, but it's just saying that in 2009 and 10, the President Putin he personally intensified efforts at reviving regional integration in the post-Soviet space. So he's trying to reintegrate the post-Soviet space. And he had this closest associate in Kazakhstan and Belarus, and had an ambitious post-Soviet integration project, the Eurasian Economic Union. So he was trying to implement the Eurasian Economic Union in a kind of in the same way that we have the European Union. He wanted to, talk about the Eurasian Economic Union. This paper talks about Putin actually, some of the historical theorists that believe the Eurasia is an actual continent. So we've got Europe, we've got Asia, and in between there we have Eurasia, which is a whole continent in itself. And Putin really believes in that, apparently, from these sources. So it's really about, there's this sort of nationalist, but this really territorialist, like we are important and we want to be considered important here, and we want to be noticed and be respected, right? This is the feeling that I kept getting from the articles that I was reading from, so then again, that's kept giving me this feeling that the Soviet Union's chart is still relevant, yeah, because he considers the biggest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. So then I did the synastry. So on the left, we have the modern Russian chart, the one that I said I chose based on a conversation I had with Rod, and Putin around. Now, Putin around, because he's data, we don't know the time of his birth, so his chart is around. And on the right, we have the Soviet Union. So Putin around the Russian chart, I didn't get to see many synastry interaspects between the two charts, to be honest. Like, there are a couple, you know, I mean, if the data was correct, his ascendant would be close to Venus. His sun is a square to the moon and Neptune. Now, also, not to forget that this chart was a transit in Putin's life. Now, Putin was an agent in KGB. So for him, you know, when the Soviet Union was dissolved and all of that happened, that was a transit as well. And that was a Neptune transit to his sun. So his sense of identity, his sense of who he was somehow dissolved throughout that process. Was Uranus is square his sun in Libra as well. It was also close to a Uranus opposition, what we call the midlife crisis. But I don't really see any particular intense, you know, or interesting. He was having also a Pluto square transit. So it seems like it was a big moment in Putin's life, but I don't particularly see any strong connection there. Now let's have a look at the Soviet on the right-hand side. Now, on the Soviet one, I noticed that there is a Sun Chiron double whammy. So Putin's Chiron on Soviet Union's Sun, and also obviously picking up on the T-square, and Putin's Sun opposite Soviet Union's Chiron. So there is a Sun Chiron thing going on there. Identity, the wounded self. There is something there that connects the two. We also have a South Node Neptune, which would be a generational interaspect. We have a Saturn conjunction. So when Putin was born, it was a Saturn return for the Soviet Union in 52. So there is a kind of a Saturn connection there. There's also Neptune to Saturn as well. There is a Jupiter-Venus, but also Putin's Jupiter is on the Soviet Union midheaven. I thought that was a very revealing aspect as well, because the midheaven is the reputation, right? Is what a place is known for, and the most visible part of a place or a person's as well, if we're talking about a person's chart. But Jupiter on the midheaven really caught my attention as well as an exchange, in a synastry there. And there's also a wide Jupiter-Venus opposition. So kind of a wide, but a double whammy Venus-Jupiter there as well. So I felt there's enough interchange, aspects between Putin and the Soviet Union's chart, more than the Russian one in a way. Let's have a look at Ukraine. So leave that in the back of your mind there, that we kind of had a little look. We're going to see the Russian chart again later on, but let's have a look at Ukraine. Now this quote on the left is it was a paper that was published in February, 1 week after the invasion happened. And the author is saying that Ukrainian troops and citizens have exhibited notable cohesion in the face of Russian invasion. So they're actually saying that Ukraine was responding really well. And what's important from that quote really is that they're really saying that Ukrainians, they stayed in cohesion together around the Ukrainian sense of identity. And I think this is something very important as well about what's going on, as I perceived from all the research I've done. So it's saying that, the citizens have taken up arms, supported deployed fighters, shown strong social support for the standing government, and have united around the Ukrainian identity. And then they're saying that Russians not so much on the second bit of the quote here. But here is Ukraine's chart. And what caused my attention, and you probably have seen the chart quite a lot, what I find interesting is Pluto in the midheaven. This is something to keep in mind there that we're going to look again later on. But, the midheaven is what the place is known for. And Ukraine has gone through a lot of different crises. And one of the things that I really that I really saw again and again throughout the research is that Ukrainians are very resilient. And I think that Saturn in the first house and then Pluto in the midheaven somehow represents a little bit that. I mean, I know the moon represents the population and is in a Saturn ruled sign, is a moon in Aquarius. But there is a real strong resilience. That moon is also square Pluto on the midheaven. That's a very important point there in their charts. They also have a North Node on the ascendant. And I felt that North Node on the ascendant, what I've been seeing as well, there's a sense of Ukraine's trying to really give birth to a sense of identity that's separated from Russia. You know, I've seen articles as well where Kiev had a very strong, important place in Russian history, and they believe that Russia was born in Kiev. So some people really believe that Ukraine is part of Russia and it should be part of Russia. So the whole point I've been seeing is that Ukraine is trying to emerge as an independent country with their own identity, separated from Russia. So this is an important point as well. Here we have Zelensky chart, and I'm sure you also have seen a few times, so I'm not going to spend much time on his chart. But it also, one of the articles is also praising Zelensky and how he was doing well, and he demonstrated leadership and inspiring the Ukrainian forces and encouraging civilians. And also has been able to obtain military aid from the West. So they were really praising his role and his work. His synastry with Ukraine is very interesting. I'm particularly interested on his Uranus on the Pluto. That Pluto for me seems to be a very sensitive point in Ukraine's chart. And he has his Uranus there, which obviously is generational. But I feel because of the role he has, that he could really change something in Ukraine or in how Ukraine is seen, and that sense of public identity that Ukraine has. And obviously we have a Sun-Saturn double whammy here. So a sense of connection, of responsibility is very strong. Zelensky's Sun, Venus conjunction in Aquarius on Ukraine's Saturn, and his Saturn, so Zelensky's Saturn on Ukraine's Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, and opposite the moon as well. They also have moon opposition. So we have this interesting Aquarius Leo going on between their synastry. Also, his Mercury, which is his chart ruler, is very close to the ascendant of Ukraine. So it does kind of represent a potential sense of identity there as well. Like we can see, or I can see, the investment, and like really trying to gather the population together and get through these difficult times by looking at this synastry. But I had the feeling that I had to go back a little bit, because if this was about a second Cold War, then what about the first Cold War? So the first Cold War happened or started on the 12th of March 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine was an American foreign policy that originated with the primary goal of containing Soviet geopolitical expansion during the Cold War. So there is a kind of a resonance with what we're seeing now, right? With what we're seeing happening now. The interesting thing of Cold War's chart, now obviously I don't know what time that happened, so all of the angles cannot really be considered. But what was really interesting is that was the year that Saturn-Pluto had a conjunction. So the beginning of the Cold War, it was later in the year, Saturn and Pluto conjoined at 12 Leo. So it's the year of the conjunction, which, we just had a Saturn-Pluto conjunction not too long ago, like 2 years ago. So there's something, of a resonance within those cycles there somehow. And when we think about a Saturn-Pluto cycle, and we talked a lot about it, right? We're seeing everywhere, we're talking about that Capricorn that happened in 2020 as a kind of a new world order, right? It's a kind of a beginning of a new world order. Well, that's what was going on when the Cold War started. 2 years later, we have the birth of NATO. which is another very important player in the situation, and we'll be hearing as well on the news, and NATO this, and Putin doesn't want, you know, Ukraine to join NATO, and that's the problem. He doesn't want any of the Soviet countries to join NATO, blah, blah, blah. Well, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the foundation of it was in 1949. And it was against totalitarian regimes, and it was an aftermath of World War II. Again, this chart that we're seeing there doesn't have a precise time, so we can't really consider angles, houses, etc. But yet, we have this big stellium in Aries here, and this was something that I found really interesting. So Mercury, Mars, Venus, Sun, North Node, they're all in Aries there. And this is all about being against a totalitarian regime, right? It's all about defense and defending the, you know, countries that are like members of it. And defending democracy as well is one of the ideals that they're sort of defending through NATO. So NATO went from 12 countries to 30, which actually became 32 now. But at the time when I was gathering these papers, so in February, I think this one was written, was saying NATO is now emerging as a leading element in European security after having been in decline for years. So it has been reported that the possibility of joining NATO is also being discussed in Finland, which has a long border with Russia, and Sweden. And we know that they've joined it. So they've recently joined it, but they were already talking about joining it. Now, the last paper I read, which was the most recent one, which is from the end of April, they're talking about the possibility of Austria and Switzerland joining it as well. So it's still growing, and they're kind of recovering, you know, they're bringing that more to the table. But yes, I find that stellium in Aries particularly interesting. Is opposite Neptune here as well. But we also have a kind of 29-degree Leo Saturn, which I also find a bit interesting, but a grand trine with Pluto. So we have a Pluto at 14 Leo, trine Chiron at 8 degrees Sag, trine that Mars, Venus, Sun conjunction in Aries. I thought that was very interesting as a signature for NATO. Now, what we're seeing in front of us is I just thought it was interesting to have that graph. And this is a figure on how much expenditure in military, and it's, you know, very good source, really, you know, pretty scientific, got from this, I think the article from April. And obviously the US is the one that spent the most, and this is numbers for 2021. NATO's got 336 billions, but look at China. So China has 332 billions, and China has been a bit in the concern and the situation there as well. And one of the articles have been talking about China potentially supporting Russia. And, you know, that this might be the main difference between Cold War I and Cold War II, is that maybe China and Russia will organize themselves together as a possibility. But I thought it was interesting to see those numbers in front of us, just as, you know, as a curiosity. Now, here we have NATO around the Soviet Union chart on the left and around the Russian chart on the right. So it really strikes me with the Soviet Union chart again. And that, so, you know, I keep saying that the Soviet Union chart seems to be really revealing throughout the whole, you know, synastries that I've done when I was putting this together, because that stellium in Aries picks up right on that Chiron in Aries and the Pluto-Sun opposition. That Mars in Aries is at 10 degrees. It's right, like pretty exact, partile square to that Pluto at 10 Cancer. So it really sort of picks up on that huge, you know, seem to be a driving force there in the Soviet chart. But not only, what I thought was really interesting is that Saturn at 29 Leo is right on the ascendant, and is about containing it, right? Not letting it expand. So I thought that was very interesting symbolism there somehow. It's also square to the Moon-Venus opposition in the Soviets chart as well. But I thought that synastry is quite powerful. The synastry with the Russian chart, that stellium in Aries does square Uranus, Moon, and Neptune. The nodes square the ascendant descendant, But again, like, I don't see a lot of interchanges there. It doesn't call my attention as much. I mean, we have Chiron on Mars there, but it doesn't really call my attention as much. But yet, I mean, this Russian chart seems to be relevant to me because of that Chiron in Leo in the first. And a lot of the things I was reading was really connected with this response that we're seeing from Russia, is really connected with the sense of grandeur, like of being really seen as someone important, and not being seen as someone important has really kind of triggered a lot of the situations that we're seeing. So here we have the chart of European Union, which I also think is an important part in the situation there as well. And the European Union obviously is considered a superpower. And the author in one of the papers was saying that the European Union sort of undermined, or Western, we're talking about Western Europe, undermined, that they were undermining Russia's attempt to redefine its own identity as a normal economic great power. And that undermining pushed Russia to regain its greatness through more assertive, if not aggressive forms. So there's something about Russia, and it goes back way in history as well, because when we're having the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe, Russia was still heavily agricultural, and they were trying to catch up. And there was this feeling of them trying to catch up and be seen as part of the club. It's like, but we're also very important, and you also need to ask my opinion, and etc. It seems like this is something very important and a big part of this whole situation. I'm not going to go too much in the European Union chart because there's more to come. And I believe that you also all have seen the European Union's chart a few times. But the synastry is also interesting. It's picking up on Pluto. I mean, obviously the European Union was born not too long after Ukraine and the Soviet Union was dissolved. So that happened in 91, and the European Union was 93. So there's a kind of a commonality there. But that Moon, Mars, Pluto opposition square Saturn that the European Union has does tie into the charts quite interestingly. And obviously,
Fernanda, sorry to interrupt, but on the chart on the left, is it the European Union's chart on the outer ring?
That Russian one inside and the EU out. And both, I mean, the one here is Ukraine. So we've got Ukraine and the EU out. But don't worry too much, paying too much attention. This is me, like when I was doing my, little detective work, trying to find some interesting connections there, because the EU is also an important part in this whole situation that's happening there. And mind, I mean, the EU is having their Saturn return, isn't it? Saturn 25 degrees Aquarius now, and Saturn is on Ukraine's moon. Look, the European Union Saturn there. But don't worry too much. I just thought, okay, European Union, let's have a look. What's the interchange there? And why the EU? And then that takes us a little bit back as well. And this is just a quote saying that the EU, considers that there was an international law breached by Russia, really, because they're not recognizing Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. So human rights as well, and not respecting Ukrainian citizens' right to self-determination. And that takes us back to the Euromaidan. Now, I don't remember if you all remember this, but in November 2013, February 2014, there was a big crisis in Ukraine as well. And that was known as the Euromaidan, and which then culminated on the Revolution of Dignity in February 2014. And it all started with the European Union going to Ukraine. They were going to sign an economic, like a free trade economic treaty. It wasn't about Ukraine entering European Union yet. It wasn't about Ukraine joining NATO. There was nothing to do with that. But Putin sort of got involved. And so the president at the time that had a lot of sympathy or empathy to Putin and to Russia, declined the signing the economic, free trade. So the population was very unhappy about that because they felt that they could finally change their lives and, etc. So they weren't very happy about that. So they started a peaceful protest. Now there is a very interesting documentary on Netflix about that. And at times it's a little bit hard to watch because it's very, graphic with all the violence that they suffered around those months. But what started as a peaceful protest ended up becoming as a revolution, and police shooting them and killing the population, killing civilians. So it was a real challenging period for Ukraine, but people really stood up. And it's really amazing to see what we were discussing a few slides before on how they stood in cohesion. And there was a sense of unity and a sense of togetherness around this Ukrainian identity and the resilience that they really showed in that. So the chart on the left that we have is November 2013, which is when the protests started. So that's when the Euromaidan started. They're protesting because they want to have the economic free trade with the European Union. So it's very interesting because the transits at that time is Saturn on Pluto. So Saturn was at 16 degrees Scorpio on that Pluto in the midheaven. Remember I mentioned before as like an important sensitive spot. So that Saturn there coming to the midheaven. Jupiter was also retrograde in Cancer, kind of hovering about the descendant. And I think that's kind of revealing a reflection of new partnerships or new opportunities there that they were fighting for during that period. We also had Pluto at 9 degrees Capricorn on Uranus. That Uranus at 10 degrees Capricorn there. And Neptune was opposite the Sun as well. So the Sun is a 0 degree Virgo. Neptune is opposite that. So by the end of it, in February 2014, when they managed to, the president has fallen, lost his power, flee the country, go to Russia, big surprise. So Putin looks after him. So he falls from power. And it's a big victory for the Ukrainian population, really. The transit's there, and that's what we have here, the 22nd of February. And funny enough, 22nd of February, which is the same date of the invasion now, right? Years after. We have Saturn at 23. So Saturn is a square, the moon, just past that square. I mean, if you watch the documentary, you see how the population stood together and looked after each other. You have children, you have elderly people, you have everyone in the streets cooking for each other, gathering together, fighting with whatever weapons they could create together, teaching each other how to defend themselves and etc. It's actually really daunting and really amazing to see that. So Saturn had just squared that moon during that period. Jupiter is back to 10 degrees Cancer and is opposite Uranus. And Pluto is at 12 Capricorn, so near that Neptune as well. The NATO Neptune. And transiting Neptune is sort of still hovering around the sun, right? The sun of Ukraine chart. So the chart here is the Revolution of Dignity. So this is for February 2014. So the end, and the Russian chart, the modern Russian chart inside. So we have that Uranus at 10 Aries, is square, the moon Uranus. So basically the Jupiter, the square Uranus and Pluto is kind of picking up on these planets here. The Uranus moon in Capricorn. I think Saturn on Pluto as well. That's what kind of caused my attention the most there. And on the left, we have another quote there saying that the EU's support of the Maidan Revolution posed the threat of an irreversible change in Ukraine's orientation and in the West's attitude toward the former Soviet bloc region. So really what we're seeing now has a kind of a very strong connection to what happened then as well. Here is the Soviet chart with the Maidan, the revolution of dignity. So the end of that period. And you see how daunting those transits are. Like Jupiter is right on Pluto. Pluto had passed over that sun, but it's a square, it's an exact square to that Chiron in Aries. Saturn had transited the IC, but we also have Neptune on the descendant as well, not, too long before. And in the synastry between the Soviet Union and Ukraine, Ukraine's sun is right on the ascendant of the Soviet Union's chart because it's 0 Virgo. And I felt also this sense of like entitlement. It's like the sense of identification with like Ukraine is us. You shouldn't be free to decide what to do. So those transits for me, they felt like really powerful there. And here is the president, the Ukrainian president that declined the European free trade and that lost his power. But I mean, how wonderful is astrology that like his angles are 10 and 12 of the cardinal. I mean, when that was going on, Jupiter was on his midheaven, but Uranus was his descendant and Pluto on his IC. I mean, there was no way he was going to manage to stay in power, to go against the population, and Pluto square his Mars as well, which I thought was interesting. Now we get to the Ukrainian invasion of 2022. This is a chart for now. So this is a chart for the 29th of May. It's not too long ago, or like what's the situation there on the border. And I thought it was interesting to keep that there for us to go back to see some of the regions, because they're mentioned in some of the the things I've read as well after. We don't have a lot to go, so don't worry, we don't have many more charts to see or anything, but like when we talk about the transits, it might be interesting to go back to the geographic chart. So here we have Ukraine and the invasion chart, which I'm also sure you have seen as well. But what really strikes me is that a few years later, a couple of days later, when the revolution is ended in 2014, Saturn has moved. It's like a 7-year period, isn't it? It's a Saturn cycle. So Saturn has moved from Pluto all the way to square that Pluto. So it really seems like there is a long cycle there of that Pluto Saturn that's really representing also what's happening and what's going on. It's like a next step of what was going on back then, and this sort of potential change on their sense of identity, or Ukraine's sense of identity and recognition in the West as well, and the dynamics between the West and Russia and China as well, potentially. That really caught my attention. And obviously this whole period, Saturn has been going back and forth on Ukraine's moon, which is representing the population, right? So again, during that time of the revolution, the Saturn was to square the moon, and now Saturn is conjoined the moon and opposite the Leo planets there as well. So this, for me, this was very interesting in terms of a cycle there. Neptune has moved on as well, and is opposite Mars now as well. So it's not opposite the sun anymore, but Mars. So there's something interesting. And back then, and Chiron is at the degree where Uranus was as well at that time in 2014. So 10 degrees Aries is square Uranus. The chart of Russia with the invasion. And again, I don't particularly, again, doesn't really catches my attention too much. Neptune is on the midheaven, maybe, no boundaries, invading, annexing. We could see with that symbolism. The Venus-Mars conjunction is near the descendant. Maybe that could be, going to war. And but on the Soviet one, what do we have there? We have Jupiter on Mars. So Jupiter is on that Mars-Uranus in the 7th. We have a Chiron return there as well. We have that Venus-Mars on the chart ruler, the 21 degrees Capricorn. And we have Saturn opposite that Neptune in Leo. The sort of the dreams, the collective dreams there of being royalty, somehow being important, that perhaps, that is picking up on. I don't know. And this is my official sort of last slide, because I didn't want to put the transits. I didn't want to go in there because I really didn't want to have a go on predictions, because it's really not my expertise and I don't feel very comfortable. So this journey that we did was really going backwards to try and understand the process that we're going through now, or that we're seeing right now. But obviously, there were a couple of things that happened this year already. So if we go back to the Ukraine chart and the transits during the invasion, I mean, we see that Saturn has been around that moon in Aquarius, but also the full moon that we had on the 16th of May, that was at 25 degrees in Scorpius, is a full moon eclipse that really picked up on these planets here in Leo, which means it picked up on some of Zelensky's planets as well, etc. Well, I looked into the news of the 16th of May to see what, made news there, to see how that manifested, right, in the situation. So that headline of the 16th of May was that Sweden and Finland joined NATO. 260 Ukrainian soldiers evacuated an area, so Russians allowed them to go free in Mariupol, so this area down here. 260 soldiers survived and were able to go somewhere safe. Kharkiv, which I don't know, I'm obviously speaking wrong, Kharkiv, this area here was reclaimed, so they regained that back, Ukraine. So it was an interesting eclipse. Now we would think, oh, it's an eclipse, maybe it's going to be something horrible, etc. Well, the headlines weren't that awful. McDonald's exited Russia officially after like 32 years. They're leaving. They're not going to go back there. I mean, some people say good for the Russians, but nevertheless, that made a headline. And Ukraine won the Eurovision. That was also a headline from the 16th of May, which is the day of that full moon eclipse. So interesting. Now looking forward, right, with these transits, I just want to mention some of the transits in terms of looking forward in the situation. What we have is a couple of full moons, which resonate with the full moons back in 2014, by the way, on the 24, 26, 27 degrees of the fixed, Taurus, Scorpio, Aquarius, Leo, that triggered that situation and triggered this situation here as well. We had a full moon at 27 Leo just a few days before the invasion this year. We're still going to have more of these full moons. We have in August in Aquarius, we have an eclipse in November against 16 Taurus, which will pick up this Pluto here, and there will be some unfoldments there. And I mean, with Saturn going retrograde soon, is at 25 right now. So we'll go back to that moon again, to the Ukrainian moon. It will be July, August. It will go backwards over that moon, and then it will go again in December, January, but forward. So Saturn is still going back and forth on Ukraine's moon. So it feels like the situation seems to take longer. And then I read in some of the articles that we might be looking at something that will last, that's like grinding and like slow, and that Russians thought it will be a lot faster and easier to take over, but and another thing to watch out as well is October. We have the Uranus-Saturn square, the last square between Uranus and Saturn at 18 Aquarius Taurus. Now that's going to be quite close and picking up that Pluto there, and things could be interesting around that time as well. And then for 2023, we have Uranus coming to Ukraine's IC. We have Pluto entering Aquarius and coming close to that Saturn, which is the chart ruler of Ukraine. We also have Saturn opposite the Sun, because Saturn will move to Pisces. And Neptune will still opposite Mars. But these transits for next year did seem to me as a kind of a reconsolidation of identity. The Saturn with the Sun, the Pluto with the chart ruler, the Uranus on the IC, you know, and a kind of a rebuild of a sense of identity somehow. But that's as far as I can go in terms of predictions in relation to what's going to happen. So this is a bibliography I used, all of the different articles and the different things that I looked into. This is my contact if you'd like to send me a message or to check some more things. They're all there. And the Out of Bounds Astrology podcast I do with Alejo. So it's quite amazing that he's coming next to do a talk as well. There's a little joint project that we have. But anyways, this is me for the evening. I hope I am in time.